I am Isis with Sistah Scifi. Welcome to Sistah Scifi Wind Down Wednesday. And we're working hard to make Wednesday your new favorite day of the week. So today we are here with the author of The Avengers Assembled. So this is a graphic novel and the origin stories of the Earth's mightiest heroes and a new set of adventures based of some of our favorite Marvel superheroes. And I'll be joined by David the Betancourt shortly. Oh, hey, here's David. So David, I will send you. Hey, JB Free, how are you? Let me know how you're doing in the chat. I'm good. My Wednesday has been good. I can't complain. David, I sent you a join request. Okay, so I sent you another one, and hopefully it works this time. So yeah, I can't believe it's October, which means it's fall, which it was particularly warm today in the Bay Area, which I appreciate. So yeah. So JB, let me know how you are doing in the chat, and I can see the chat. Hey Jai, how are you? I haven't seen you in a live in a minute. Let me know how your week is treating you in the chat. Okay, there we go. Hey David, how are you?
How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Hey, how's your week been?
Doing okay, little Ahsoka, little Loki. I've been pretty busy.
Okay, I like it. A good place to start is, please, before we dive into the questions, I think that may have been shared for you for the Avengers the Avengers Assembled. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is David Betancourt. I'm the comic book culture reporter at the Washington Post. I've been at the Washington Post for 16 years. I've been writing in the style section for about almost a decade. And I'm also a writer for Marvel, where I've written various Miles Morales adventures, one that came out last week on Marvel Unlimited, and of course, writer of books, The Avengers Assembled.
Yay. Okay. Thank you so much for that. I'm excited to have you on I keep trying to touch my screen. Have you on today. Did you grow up reading Marvel comics, or is that something you discovered later in life?
Oh, absolutely. I've been reading Marvel comics probably since I was about 8 years old. My father is an avid Marvel Comics fan as well. And he's from that generation where you're either Marvel or DC. I don't think they really make people like that anymore. I kind of look at people like that, kind of like VCRs, like, I just like Marvel or I just like DC. My dad was very much a Marvel guy. He had a huge Marvel Comics collection. And so that was kind of something we shared together. Him and I both reading comics. I still remember growing up at my grandparents' house. I'm here in Washington, D.C. It's where I was born. My father was raised nearby in Prince George's County, and going to my grandparents' house, the 7-Eleven right by them, just the spinner rack, back when you could get comics at 7-Eleven.
Right, I was like 7-Eleven.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm dating myself there, but they used to always have spinner racks where you could get comics. So those are actually where I got my first comics from.
Nice. Nice. And so when you think about like picking up and reading primarily Marvel comics with your dad, what were the first characters or series that y'all really got into?
Oh, Spider-Man, absolutely. I was fascinated with Spider-Man at an early age, and knowing that that would be a character that would impact me on a personal level much later in life with the invention of Miles Morales. But yeah, Spider-Man, the Avengers. Obviously, I started reading comics in the 90s, and in the 1990s at Marvel Comics, there was nothing bigger than X-Men by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. Those were like rock star comics that, have the sales numbers have not been matched. But the 90s were a wild time to be a comics fan because, you had Image Comics, which kind of broke out in the early 90s. And it was like this extreme era and crazy costumes, and everyone weighed 400 pounds. And it was just a wild, wild time to be a comics fan.
I could see that. Yeah. Yes. The Marilyn Zane says PG County shout
All
out. So I heard the
right.
Prince George's County. So have to um, represent that. I'm not from Washington D.C. though, but I do have this fascination with Prince George's County. Um,
Gorgeous Prince George.
um, the next question is: your career is steeped in the mythos of comic culture. How did you weave your love of comics into your work? Like, how did you make that into what it seems to be a career?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot because my beat is very unorthodox. Not something, there aren't a lot of people at a national news media level that cover comic culture the way that I do. There's myself, there's my colleague Michael Kavanagh, there's George Costanez at the New York Times, there are a couple of folks at the LA Times with Hero Complex, but it's not the same thing as, having a sports department and having a business department and a politics department and a national department and a foreign department and travel department. Not all news organizations have a comic book department. So obviously it was something that I was very passionate about, and very fortunate that at the time, as I mentioned, my colleague Michael Kavanagh, he had created a blog called Comic Riffs. And Michael was a former syndicated cartoonist, and he spent a lot of time writing about comic strips, because comic strips were still very popular in the Washington Post. And it just so happened I came along. Michael and I were introduced by my former editor, Marcia Davis, and I had just written a story about Captain America, when
Hmm.
Bucky became Captain America, and Captain America was holding a gun, and the imagery of that was very. Even though if you look back at the old comics, the really old Captain America comics, he's got a gun. Chris Evans in the movie was packing heat with a shield, but for a long time it was just a shield and that was it. So the imagery of him in a new suit and a gun, we didn't know it was Bucky Barnes under the suit yet. Marvel hadn't revealed who it was. So I remember running to my editors and saying, showing them the image, Captain America's got a gun. This is going to be a big deal. We need to write about this. And they let me. I think I was maybe 27 years old at the time, just a pup in the newsroom. And after I wrote that story, Marcia Davis said to me, you should meet Michael Kavanagh. He's new here in style, relatively new, and he's kind of into the same stuff. Michael would go on to found the Comic Riffs blog, and he spent so much time writing about comic strips. There was kind of an opening for some. I basically went to Michael and said, hey, how would you feel if I wrote for you in the blog, but kind of covered comic books and superheroes and things like that? And it worked out. So I started writing for Michael, and I had left the Post for a time, for about 3 years. I started in 04, left in 09, and for 3 years I was doing government contracting. During that time, the Miles Morales announcement happened, and
Mm.
Michael reached out to me and said, look, I know you're not here anymore, but I really need you to write about this, because Miles was announced as someone who was Latino and Black. And if you know my background, my father's from Puerto Rico, my mother's African American. So I wrote an essay about it, and that really kind of, me and Michael were really tight after that. So when I came back to the Post in 2012, after a 3-year hiatus, Kevin Merida, who is now the executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, he was the #2 guy at the Washington Post back then. No Black editor had ever been ranked that high at the Washington Post at the time. And he had a message to all of us, reporters of color, especially Black reporters in the newsroom, saying, that his door was open, and he was open to ideas and new things, and it didn't matter who you were, where you were on the totem pole. So I went into Kevin's office frequently and said, hey, this superhero thing is about to take, this is like 2011,
Mm-hmm.
2012, right before the first Avengers movie came out. So the MCU was in its infancy, but that big Avengers movie hadn't come out yet. So bugging Kevin for a couple of years, and then Avengers makes $200 million at the box office. So after about, I'd say, 3 years of bugging Kevin, one of the last things he did before he left the Post was put me in the style section where I could cover it, which I've been doing full time since 2015.
I I love that story, and I have so many follow-up questions. But as you know, Marvel makes me stick to the script. So I'll send that to you via email or something. I don't know. So next question before Marvel comes after me. How did the Avengers Assemble come to be?
So the Avengers Assemble came to be actually from a story that I wrote for the Washington Post, actually. Um, there's this new publishing initiative with Star Wars books called The High Republic. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with it. It's Star Wars about 200 years before the Skywalkers. So Yoda's still around. He's like young and spry. He's only about 200 years old, whatever you want to call it. But it's a long, long time ago before it. It's basically the era where the Jedi were at their peak, when the Jedi were just galactic legends, and it was their most honorable time. So anyway, I did a story on the High Republic where I interviewed all of the authors who were part of the first wave, and also Charles Soule, uh, Claudia Gray, lots of, I mean, there were about 5 or 6 authors, but also Michael Siglin was on that call. Michael Siglin is one of the heads of Lucasfilm Publishing. And Michael reached out to me, I want to say maybe a month or so after the story came out. And he deals with DK a lot. DK is a publisher of the Avengers Assembled. They deal with lots of licensed work, in the comic book realm. And he said that DK was looking for someone to write an Avengers novel. And the thing about that story, I spent an hour. This is 2020. We're quarantining.
Right.
We're Zooming for the first time. So it was an hour-long Zoom. And, back then you were always happy to have any type of conversation you could on a Zoom call. But I think what Michael was able to get from that hour-long conversation that we had was that I wasn't the typical reporter that covers comics and geek culture, where I'm kind of looking at it as someone who's not into it and, just writing about it because it's pop. He could tell that I was really into this stuff. I spoke the language, if you will.
Yes.
So with that, he reached out and said, DK's looking for someone to write an Avengers novel. Would you be interested in something like that? And I was kind of caught off guard. I'd written a couple of comics for Marvel at that point, but writing a comic book and writing a book are two very different things. From writing a 22-page comic book adventure to writing a 300-page novel where there's no art. You are the art. Your words are the art. So I'd never written a book before. I took it as a challenge, but I was also very interested in it. They wanted an origin story, so it was myself, Marvel, and DK. We had our initial meetings and said, what do we want to do here? And I said, well, if you guys want an origin story, we need to do it about the original team. And that meant, the initial comics that began publishing in 1963. And that roster of Captain America came along eventually, but Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Giant Man, Wasp, Iron Man, the founding members. So when we decided that was a roster that we were going to focus on, I basically put it upon myself to read the first 100 issues of the Avengers, and kind of I tried to identify like the top moments of that first decade of publishing, if you will. So as you get towards issue 100, one of the biggest things that happens to the team is the Kree-Skrull War. And if you read the book, you know that that's one of the final chapters in the book. That was a moment where the Avengers went from the protectors of Earth to protectors.
And that's not his book, because I don't know who on the live has read the book. So, yeah. So just continue. I don't like, no, yeah. Go ahead.
No, but it's not a spoiler. I mean, it's in,
Okay.
if you read the intros or anything about that, you'll know that that's a key point. But that was the key point for me in realizing that we could take it from the founding of the team to the moment they became protectors of more than just Earth. And obviously I couldn't fit 100 issues into a 300-page book, so I felt like a curator, kind of more or less picking. I said, okay, let's do a top 25, the top 25 moments within those first 100 issues. So obviously that was Iron Man becoming Iron Man. You basically get a chapter meeting each member for the first time. but moments like finding Captain America, the arrival of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, certain members quitting the team, new members joining the team that used to be villains. There was so many things from that first 100 issues and it was really fun because I was always aware of those issues, but we all have our preferences as comic book fans, and we tend to think that our generation stuff is cooler and better than the previous generation stuff. So I never spent a lot of time reading the comics that my father grew up reading in the 60s and 70s because I was a 90s kid and I wanted to read my 90s comics. So I was very familiar with some of the key moments, but I had never actually taken the time to really dive into that first decade of Avengers publishing. So it was really rewarding, and I hope that the book shows that.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. So for us, a couple people just joined. So for those of you who just joined, we're discussing the Avengers Assembled with David Betancourt, and he's answering the question, how did the Avengers Assemble came to be? And a lot of the research, I won't lie, when DK reached out to me about discussing this book, I was very intimidated because I run a sci-fi store. People think I've read all the comic books and I have to be like, I know so little about comic books, and David is going to be like, what is wrong with you? And I'm enjoying like the additional context. So the next question I have is, how did you settle on the format? And somebody in the chat is like, I feel you in terms of wanting to read your current era and sometimes not wanting to go back to previous eras. So how did you decide? So you talk about like, this is your first book. Historically, like you're a journalist, you've written some short stories. So how is it like it's going to be a book? It's mostly text. We'll talk later about some of the comic inserts, but it's not a graphic novel.
It's not. It's definitely a book. It's, the challenge was, again, finding those key moments that, it's one thing to say, okay, I've read the first 100 issues. Here are the 25 things that really stood out that I think could each be an individual chapter. Whether that's going to combine together, form like Voltron and make a great book, you don't know until you do it. I was very fortunate to have an incredible editor named Alice Google, who edited the book. He was a senior editor on the book and my primary source at DK. So Alistair and I he was across the pond in London, so we spent a lot of times early morning for me, afternoon for him, talking. But Alistair is slightly older than me, and he grew up reading those same comics that I was researching for the book. So it would be so fun going through edits with him. I'm writing a chapter, I send it to him, he edits and he sends it back. And then we're having, video conferences, and he's saying, oh man, I remember when I was young and I read that particular issue. And, and that familiarity really helped in terms of shaping those chapters and really them being the best they could be, because I wasn't just being edited by someone who's a great book editor. Alistair, I'd run through a brick wall for that guy. This was my first book. I was very nervous, and he made me feel like a pro. But being edited by someone who's not only a good book editor, but also had already read all the comics and grew up with those same comics and had an appreciation that I knew just from Alistair editing the book that people in his age range who grew up with those comics could have a great enjoyment of the book.
I love it. Again, more follow-up questions, but since Marvel is making me stick to the script, this next question goes to the art. The comic pages included in the book. What was the selection process? And here we go. So this is some of the artwork, which hopefully is showing up clearly on my phone. So what was the process of selecting the pieces that got included in the book?
We tried to. Obviously, we couldn't fit everything, but we all the panels that you see are panels from issues, the comic books that actually inspired the book. Towards the end of the book, there's actually a index that lets you know all of the specific comics that inspired the book. And the dialogue in the book is actually direct quote pulls from those word balloons from those comics. So what we wanted to do is just give a little bit of flavor of what those actual comics look like that inspired the chapters. So all the art you see is artwork and panels from the comics that inspired the book.
I love that. I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I'm gonna do this anyway. Espresso asked, does your work delve into the migration of comic character language, i.e., bunk to explicitives? And I don't.
Could you say that question again? I didn't.
You see it in that. Does your book? So let's skip that one. Because I should stick to the script. And then I'll send it to you via
Yeah, sure.
email. And then I'll follow up with everyone in social media posts. So I know for you, and particularly with your editor, there was like a lot of going back and researching into the first decade, the original decade of Avengers Assembled. How would you like your readers to enjoy the Avengers Assembled?
Um, I would say go into it with an open mind. I know from experience because I was like this. I grew up with very different Avengers rosters, reading comics in the 90s and 2000s. I myself was I was at my most avid reading Avengers comics after the first movie came out, starting with the run by writer Jonathan Hickman. So I'd only been reading Avengers comics in a dedicated way for about a decade. I read some West Coast Avengers when I was a kid and things like that, but I am someone who would potentially be skeptical about a book like this just because it's based off of comics that I myself did not grow up with. But I would say that, the book is for everyone. I think it's an easy read for whether you're extremely knowledgeable about that era or not. I think if you are knowledgeable about that area, it will be very nostalgic. And if you're not, it'll be a great learning experience in terms of what the team was like when they were initially created.
Mm, okay. So 2 points of entry, which brings me to my next question. I did not grow up reading comics. I mentioned that earlier. What are some things that readers like me will learn about some of their favorite Marvel superheroes?
Each of the characters is so different. No two Avengers are alike. Um, I think people, especially if your familiarity with these characters comes perhaps from the live action movies, the adaptations, I think people will see similarities but slight differences. Tony Stark is still the most confident man on the planet. The Hulk is a very conflicted individual that feels that what he brings to the team is a curse. Uh, Giant Man is a very complicated guy who has this great life partner in the Wasp and is kind of blinded by his ambition to be the best scientist he can be and perhaps doesn't appreciate her the way that he should. The complex relationship between Hawkeye and the Black Widow. Hawkeye's origins, I think, will be very surprising to those that aren't familiar with him. He had a very wild upbringing with him and his brother, basically growing up on a circus. Uh, but there's also a little dash of modern as well, because what we decided we wanted to do, 90% of the book is that original team in the first decade, but we do give you a splash of one of the more modern teams as well, with Sam Wilson as Captain America and Kamala Khan and Miles Morales and Nova and the modernized Vision. Vision was actually one of my favorite chapters too, the old school Vision, but also you get to meet the more modern Vision with the new team as well. So it's a nice kind of Avengers buffet. You're getting like this great brush up on the original team, but there's a little bit of the dash of modern 21st century Avengers as well.
Yeah, M. Shy, who is also a DC-based author, says, "What I didn't know that about Hawkeye." So thank you for sharing. For those of you who just joined, including M. Shy, we are discussing the Avengers Assembled. This is a paperback. I'm very excited about it. Um, so yeah. Which origin story did you enjoy exploring the most? Before you answer that, I'm gonna just slip this one out in. Clarence A. Hayes is also on, who we spoke about. Clarence is an amazing editor and writer. His question went by really fast. What part of yourself did you add to the general story and characters?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say there's a little bit of my fun personality in the Iron Man chapter. Um, I have on my Puerto Rican side of the family, there are a few Latin playboys in there that I feel like veer into that Tony Stark territory. So I may have been channeling them a little bit when I was writing those chapters. But for the most part, I really had to stick to the script of, the rules were very clear that we were pulling only from the comics, that these wouldn't be based on the movies, it'd be based on the comics. Dialogue would only come from the comics. So there was only so much room to add new twists or new wrinkles, but still, I still had a blast doing it.
Okay. So we'll be looking for some of the Latin playboys and all that good stuff.
Not Tony the Latin playboy, but just saying that.
Yeah, channeling. Yeah.
Thought about some of the crazy uncles in my life.
Which origin story did you enjoy exploring the most?
I would say Hawkeye is up there. He's got a really unique origin story that really starts when he's a very young boy. And also the Vision. I was very intrigued by his creation and his relationship with Ultron, and how complicated it is, and how much respect the Vision has for humanity, whereas Ultron despises it.
Mm, mm. Yeah. I want to read and bring in some of the comments. So Clarence is from Panama descent. I did not know that. So you have a Latinx brother in cyberspace.
Went to Panama when I was 15. Loved Panama.
Yeah, and I'm reading C. Espresso's. Is there a digital edition? And I think you mean ebook. And the answer to that is yes. I think I saw audiobook, which if there's an audiobook available, that will be available only broadband. And of course, we have signed hardcover editions available directly on Sistah Scifi. So hopefully I answered that question. I'm also trying to read the questions.
Sure. Take your time.
So I'm gonna read this question. Again, I'm not super knowledgeable about comics, so I'm like, I can't give you, I'm shy. You might have to. Is this a reboot in the same way Alan Moore and Brian Boland rebooted The Killing Joke, or are the stories totally new?
These are not new stories. These are retellings of original stories from the first decade of Avengers publishing.
So I think that answers your question. Thank you for that.
So if you've read comics from the first decade, you will recognize the tales in this book.
Excellent. So yeah. Then my final question that was somewhat approved from Marvel. What's next for Avengers Assembled? And you can answer that in terms of what you would like to see next for them. Is there a sequel? Like a broad question, what's next?
We haven't had any chats yet in terms of what could potentially be the next step. This was kind of a new terrain for Marvel Publishing in terms of writing a book like this. But a lot of fun was had. I think both myself and DK are happy with how the book turned out. And, if the response is right, maybe that opens up the door to either tell more Avengers tales or perhaps use this format for other Marvel characters.
Okay. I don't think I can ask that. And in a question we have in the chat, it says, a full-time journalist and dad, how did you find time to write The Avengers Assembled?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a very realistic and great question. I am a full-time journalist. I am a father and a husband. My family was very understanding of this project that I took on. My kids spent a lot of time looking at their father staring at a computer. I tried my hardest. I did not take book leave for this. So it was a lot of, a lot of post reporters do take book leave when they work on books. I did not. So this was about 8 months of a lot of nights and weekends, early mornings, late nights, always on the weekends. And, I made it work. It was something I wanted to do. And, you just have to find the time. My wife was great. There would be days where I'd say, I'm just going to close my eyes for 15 minutes and start writing a book. And then she'd let me sleep for 2 hours and then wake me up and be like, hey, you need to write this chapter. Let's go. So it was definitely a team effort. My family was very understanding, and I'm very appreciative of them for allowing me to take the time to do this.
Yeah, so, and we're super impressed. MSHI says, like, you wrote this on top of, like, your familiar responsibilities and your work responsibilities. And then you get big ups from Erica Hardison at Fabulous Magazine, who's usually, like, my go-to expert on all things, like, comic book culture. So, yeah. So it's let me know if there are any other questions in the chat. Thank you for those that have flowed through thus far. Hopefully Marvel does not kill me for going off script. So we'll flow into a little bit of this or that while we wait for more questions. This or that is kind of fun. The way it works is that I give you two options, this or that. You can respond to, like, usually rapid fire, the one you would choose. You are not required to choose. And if you're watching, feel free to drop your choice in the chat. It's my second favorite part of this live. The first favorite part is everything we've been doing thus far. Okay, ready? Any questions?
Nope, ready to go.
Okay, first one. Janelle Monáe or Beyonce?
Oh, come on. I love both of them. I mean, I am old enough that I remember when Destiny's Child videos were only on BET. That's how old I am. And I would run to school and I would say, yo, there's this girl in this group, Destiny's Child, and her name is Beyonce, and she is incredible. And, at my suburban school, everyone was looking at me like I was crazy. But, I was right. Beyonce is the greatest. But I love Janelle Monáe as well. I loved her in Knives Out. And a lot of people don't know, but uh, her name is the most recent Black female Green Lantern. The artist Jamal Anderson, who designed her, and I believe Sean Martinborough is another artist who was involved in that design as well. They based the look of that Green Lantern. Yeah, Far Sector. There it is, right there. That whole look is based off Janelle Monáe and her kind of Afro-futuristic style. So I'm gonna have to say push. I love both those ladies.
We love it. The chat was like waiting. They were like, choose wisely. What is he?
Choose your fight.
You know what? We'll go with that answer. So yes, I always wonder what people are going to say, and so yes. There are some other ones. I'm not officially asking these questions. You could decide whether you want to answer them again. While editing. So Britt asks Loki or Thor, and then Marilee asks which Avengers story came to you the easiest to write and which was the hardest. So again, I'm not asking, but if you want to answer.
Loki, I do like Thor a lot. There's so many great Thor comics, especially the most recent run that was written by Jason Aaron that ended a couple of years ago. It was an incredible run of Thor comics created by Marvel. But Loki's a lot of fun because he's a really complex and complicated character. He's Asgardian royalty. He's adopted. His brother is like, the Asgardian god's gift to everything. Like there are a whole lot of reasons why he could have just said, you know what, I'm gonna blow up the universe. That guy's got a lot of reasons to be angry about everything. But I think Marvel has found, and a lot of this may be inspired by the role Tom Hiddleston plays in Loki in live action, but they've done a really great job kind of putting Loki in the middle. He's good and bad, and he's not one. He's kind of in the middle. He's an anti-hero, and a lot of times from a writing perspective, those characters can be more fun to write. And they also
Okay.
favorite. What was the question? Was my favorite Avengers story in the book?
Which adventure story came to you the easiest
I,
in terms of writing, and which was the hardest?
um, they were all hard. None of them came easy. Yeah, writing a book is, especially your first book, is challenging. But they were all very enjoyable. It helps that comics is a medium that I love dearly. I've been reading comics my entire life. I think I'm the reader and the writer that I am because of comic books. So, uh, but I would say they were all challenging. You know, writing a book, your first go around is something you never forget. And it was a challenge from chapter 1 to chapter 25.
Okay, okay, okay. For those of you who just joined, it seems like we have some new additions. We're discussing the Avengers Assembled with David de Betancourt. We have signed copies available at sistersci-fi.com, and we're answering questions. Marvel, please don't shoot me for going off script. Erica asked for Bad Boys Magazine, what Marvel character would you make an Avenger? I guess I'm assuming is not an Avenger.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I think he has been an Avenger at some point. The thing is that the roster has been so vast, but I guess if we're going off, hmm, I'd say maybe someone like Gambit. Gambit was my favorite X-Man growing up because he had a fancy French last name, and I didn't see a lot of people with French last names growing up, so I was like, that guy looks cool, and he's making cards glow, and he's making Rogue blush, and I'm like, this guy is pretty cool. And also, we've seen that dynamic before of X-Men being Avengers with Beast. Beast is a character who was an X-Man and an Avenger. So I'd like to see that with Gambit too. Let Gambit come over and have some fun.
Okay, okay. We're putting that into the universe, and M. Shai says I don't have to worry about being shot because Marvel zaps people with lasers. So that is good to know.
As
And another,
fade away, that's what's gonna happen.
I'm just, um, Clarence asks, hey Clarence, are there any other Marvel teams you would like to, write?
Yes. I'm a big X-Men guy. Like I said earlier in the chat, I grew up reading those 90s X-Men comics by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. There's so many fascinating characters. There's also the kind of parallel as to what being a mutant really represents. Mutants, those X-Men comics of the 60s very much mirrored the civil rights movement that was going on with the African American community here in the United States. Whether you want to parallel it to Professor X being MLK and Magneto being Malcolm X and stuff like that. But the X-Men are just a really cool team. They've got such a complex and dynamic roster that is ever changing. A team like that, I'd have a lot of fun with.
Same here. I love the X-Men. Clarence, not didn't grow up reading the comics, so based off of movies. And Clarence says, love the X-Men too, Storm and Rogue. There's a question that I can't answer because it refers to DC. I'm just saying that it's in the chat because I don't want to fade into the ether or an alternative timeline. So going back to the this or that. The next one, Shuri or Riri Ironheart Williams?
Those are actually characters that I've both had a chance to write recently. In my first Miles Morales comic for Marvel, which was a part of the Marvel Voices Comunidades anthology, Shuri makes an appearance there. And in the last Spider Smasher comic I just wrote, which features Billy Morales, Miles Morales' sister, Riri Williams is the person who designed Billy Morales' security system. They're two characters I like a lot. I'd probably say Shuri because I thought it was a big deal when she became the Black Panther in the comics. I liked it in terms of letting young girls know that they could be the Black Panther too. So I'd have to say Shuri.
Okay, Okay, I'm not mad at that response. Um, yeah, and that's a question that like a lot of this or that I've asked a lot of times. That one was new just for this chat.
Okay.
Um, I have a pick, but I'm actually trying to see what happens in the chat. So my last this or that is Moses, Magnum, or Eric Killmonger.
Hmm. I'll say Killmonger.
Okay, why?
Well, I'm very, I, I kind of veer. I'm very fascinated. I know there have been some recent Killmonger comics that have tried to veer more towards his what he turned into cinematically within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Um, but when the Black Panther movie came out, I was fascinated by the conversation Ryan Coogler was trying to start about Africa and its diaspora, and I just feel like he's such a tragic character. Like to uh, have an African American upbringing, be black in America, and then one day find out there's an African paradise where all the black people are prosperous and geniuses and it's technologically the most advanced society in the world. Oh, but those folks also killed my dad. Like Killmonger is so complex and so layered, and there's so many other conversations you can have just by talking about his origins and what led him to become the man he is. So that I think that's why I'd say Killmonger.
Hmm. Okay, I agree with that. I'd pick Killmonger too, for that one. There's some other questions. Maybe we shouldn't have said anything about X-Men because it's like, are that the X-Men? So we will follow up on those questions because again, I do not want Marvel to laser me and zap me to an alternate universe. We were discussing Avengers Assembled by David Betancourt. Um, I started asking this question recently, just because I'm like, oh, there's maybe something I forgot that I should have asked. Is there a question that when you go on book tours that you're like, I wish people would ask me X?
Hmm. Nothing comes to mind. We had a book event at the MLK Library in DC, and there were some pretty great questions there. Uh, so nothing comes to mind, but that doesn't mean a great question hasn't been asked yet.
Um, okay. Um, yeah. And I saw that event at the MLK Library, which looked amazing. I was like, I wish I was in DC to be there to participate. Um, so I'll end with, what are you reading, watching, or listening to right now?
Well, the funny, that's a good question. I've actually just gotten back into reading the Star Wars High Republic books again. The thing about writing a book is I didn't have time to read anything else. Like if ever I caught myself reading something, I was like, hey, you should be writing your book. Why are you reading this thing? The only thing you should be reading are Avengers comics right now, and that's so I just spent 8 months of primarily just reading Avengers comics. Um, I'm always hip to whatever's going on with Miles. He's one of my favorite. Miles Morales. He's one of my favorite characters ever for obvious reasons, because of what he represents in terms of who I am. Uh, let's see here. Marvel's doing some really cool things with the Hulk right now. Uh, Immortal Thor. But primarily, Miles is a guy I check up with more than anything. One, because I want to know what's going on. I want to know what's going on with him at all times, just in case Marvel ever calls me again to write him, so I can kind of just like jump back in and dive back into that world.
I love it. I love it. Um, Thank you so much for walking us through the process of Avengers Assembled. Love, and we got a lot of. I keep showing the book because I love the cover, and folks in the chat have are excited about the cover too. So if you're just joining, we have signed hard copy editions of Avengers Assembled on sistersci-fi.com. David, thank you so much for your time this evening. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for answering the questions. Yeah, that's all I have.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Okay, talk soon.
Take
Bye.
care.